All right, hello, welcome. You all having fun? I see folks up there. I wave back, it's what I do. So my name is Dutkiewicz. As it shows down here, I have a long last name. I go by the nickname Sadugi. And today we're going to talk about decision records. How many of you are decision makers today? Yeah. How many of you are writing those decisions down? Not as many hands, a lot of wiggles. Okay. Well, you're in the right spot, because I'm going to talk with you about decisions, when to capture them. All right. So I think of decisions in various ways. And so we're going to talk about different experiences. I was recently brought in on a project, and I looked at the code and think of it as like a solution with many projects. And I was looking at the projects going, why are there so many of them? Yeah. I documented what those are because somebody else is going to come on the project and go, what? We had those decisions, and we had decisions as to why they were separate projects, so we had to capture those. But sometimes you look at a solution and you go, what was this supposed to be? Any of you go from monolith to microservices? Oh yeah. Straight from monolith to microservices, or did you have that modular monolith in the middle? Because going straight from plain old monolith to microservices, you can easily get into a distributed monolith, which is a bad situation. That's what causes me to go, what architectural style was this supposed to be? Some other decisions I've run into are, why are we going with this platform? Doesn't feel like it meets our needs. We're a big organization and this is a smaller platform. But then I get the response of, hey, by the way, those budgets are tight, and this particular platform has a good discount for nonprofits. At least we understood where the decision was, but it was still a platform mismatch. Just because it's cheaper doesn't necessarily mean it's the right tool. How many of you have felt like this gentleman where you're just like ripping out your hair going, oh my gosh, why is this still using the mainframe? Is this even documented? My friend up here is pointing to his bald head. Yeah, you get enough of these, that happens. But then occasionally you'll see something like this, where I'm like, yes, they have decision records. Because now I understand, why did they make these choices? What was the context behind that decision? And like she says, she's excited because now they know why they're using that framework, and it has all the tools that will simplify their work. So, what are decision records? Think of them as a written record capturing the intricacies of a decision. The intricacies being the who, the what, the why, the when, the how, sometimes the where. All those questions go into a decision. Now, I'm going to mention this multiple times. If you're writing up a decision and you're not sure who you're writing for, think of writing your decision for future you. If we're making a decision right now, we understand the context of the decision. We know the environment. We know maybe we had developers spike out some things, so we know some gotchas. We know the context right now. But how many of you also have to deal with production fires and context interruptions? Yeah, that context that you had behind that decision is quickly going to get lost. So the whole reason why we record them is so that we capture as much as we can while we still have that context. You're writing for future you more than anybody else. I always take a selfish approach to documentation, and that future me doesn't have the same context as current me. So I got to make it easy for her. Now, any of you read Fundamentals of Software Architecture? So this is a book by Mark Richards and Neil Ford, and they talk about decision records in one of the chapters, and this is the format that they recommend. You're going to see a couple formats in this presentation, but they're not the only ones out there. So there's usually a title. The title's typically an identifier, so like ADR 001, where A is for architecture. So architecture decision record 001, and short description. We're choosing to host this on a Linux box because it's easier to maintain than Windows. It would just be platform decision. Then there's a status. The status is going to be something like draft, or proposed, accepted, superseded, obsoleted. This is so you know the validity of the decision that you're looking at as to whether this is something we're kind of working on or no, this is something we've accepted. Another suggestion when I've done this talk in the past, somebody asked about like an implemented status. So after accepted, but before superseded, because sometimes they accepted the decision, but the implementation is a little bit later. And so once that is implemented and in effect, they could have that implemented status. Then there's the context. Why do we have to make this decision in the first place? What's causing this decision? And then there's the decision. So what is the decision itself and its justification? The consequences. When I read this the first time, my head was just like, what? Because they talk about both positive consequences and negative consequences. I'm used to the negative, but there's also positive. So while they call it consequences, think of it as what is the impact, what are the trade-offs? Then there's compliance. How many of you are working in compliance environments? So like SOX, GDRP, PCI, HIPAA. When you're dealing with compliance, you gotta keep that in mind as well. So how do we ensure people comply with the decision? And how does this tie to your compliance status? And then there's notes. So any additional supporting information. Now this is the format that they use in the Fundamentals of Software Architecture. But these headings are a general recommendation. You'll evolve your template for your organization's needs. So while this looks like there's a lot going on there, we'll look at another example that has fewer headings. So this is where we get into Michael Nygaard's template. Michael Nygaard is known in this space of ADRs. So again, there's title, there's draft, status, which is draft, proposed, accepted, superseded, and obsoleted. There's the context, the decision, the consequences, and additional notes. This one doesn't get into the compliance part. All right, so who are these decision records for? Think about when you're onboarding into a code base. You probably want to see, why is this code the way it is? Why did they choose this particular language? Why did they choose this particular patterns? Why did they choose this database? Are we doing caching? What cloud did they choose and why? Like, there are so many decisions when you're onboarding into a code base, you're like, but why? Document decisions for your stakeholders. So the stakeholders, you have to hope that on your project your stakeholders stay consistent and that nobody leaves the project and nobody comes back on. However, it's never guaranteed. So you might have stakeholders today who move on, and new stakeholders come in. So document for those. And with the stakeholders especially, they're the ones who are going to ask why from an accountability standpoint. You document decision for decision makers. Again, why did we make this decision? What did we consider? There could be a time where you're like, well, I considered using these different tools. All right, consider that we wanted to make this a microservices environment. Those conversations, your decision makers will all be on the same page because that ADR needs everybody to look at it and give it their thumbs up. Selfishly, write these for yourself. Write these for future you. Because that's me probably in about a couple more hours where I want to tell somebody something. And they would be about, why? And I'll be like, because past me decided that? I don't know. I lost my context. So document these things. All right, so we talked about who are we documenting for. Now, let's talk about which decision should be captured. Well, I mean, all of them, right? We'll be here for years on end. If we're doing documentation after documentation after documentation, I mean, it does feel like that's too much. And it goes back to the shirt I'm wearing. That's a shirt in the picture if you can't see. It depends. So when I say it depends, I promise you there's more to it and I'm not going to leave you hanging. What does it depend on? So for architectural decision records, we look at the architectural significance of a decision. And there are a few different categories for that. So there's structure, there's architectural characteristics, sometimes known as ilities, even though they're not all ility. There's dependencies, there's interfaces, and construction. So let's talk about what each of these mean, what they represent, and why you want to capture those decisions. First, we'll look at the structure. So this is where we're looking at the patterns or the styles of the architecture. So are we going with a monolith, or a modular monolith, or microservices? Are we working on a simple app that can be done with like a MVC app? We're using vertical slices, clean architecture. If you're dealing with microservices, understanding your bounded contexts, all those things apply in the structure. So this is the pattern or style of the overarching architecture. Now, architectural characteristics. I hear it as ilities sometimes. Sometimes I hear them as functional characteristics. I don't like the term functional because really they're all important to functioning. It's just different pieces. So these are things like security, performance, maintainability, scalability, auditability, usability, efficiency. So these are the architectural concerns that you're like, well, we have these trade-offs, but these are the things we want to focus on. Also in architectural significance are dependencies. So this is the coupling between components. This is where we go with, do we do direct database access? Are we using an ORM or object relational mapper? Are we using shared libraries? For our APIs, are we building async or synchronous? When it comes to interfaces, this is how the services and the components are accessed. So we're looking at REST versus GraphQL, gRPC versus HTTP, event streaming. So that's where interfaces come in mind. And then there's construction. I've gotten into discussions with others because they're like, oh, those are the implementation details. Do they really need to be captured in the architecture decision records? To which I go, guys, they're decision records. It doesn't matter if it's strictly architectural or if it's things related to the architecture. And the construction is important. So yes, it's related to implementation, but it still needs documented. And so things like platforms, frameworks, tools, processes. We will see examples of these here coming up. So we can look at an ADR format, why it's related. Okay, so we talked about the who. We talked about the which. The next thing we want to talk about is when should these be captured? So when do we capture our decisions? Ideally, when you have that context. You got it now? You know what all is considered? But you might want to start documenting before the decision is finalized. Very rarely is a decision just made right on the spot. There's usually some research ahead of time. Sometimes there might be developers spiking and testing technologies and patterns out, see what works, see what doesn't work. So as the decision is getting made while the research is there, you might want to start your decision record then. As the decision is made, and after the decision is made. So you could start this at any point in this process. The thing is, you want to capture as many details as you can to answer somebody else's future why. Now, you're probably wondering then, okay, so who should capture these decisions? Well, if you're in a big enterprise environment, you might have to deal with an architecture review board. So that's where it would start in the bigger companies. You may have solution architects and other software architect types. You may have developers. If you have somebody who's really good at writing documentation, see if you can get them to help with the ADRs. It goes a lot quicker. Project managers, especially ones who write really good technical requirements. The reason I say that is because you know the value of really good requirements. That means that that quality they put in those requirements will come out in their documentation as well. I can't stress this enough. Someone who's good at creating documentation is going to do much better than somebody who is voluntold that they have to do this and they're horrible writers. Now, that said, what if you're on a team and nobody's good at writing? Happens. It happens a lot. And so if you can't find somebody who's good at creating documentation, find somebody who's good with AI. I promise you there's one other AI reference toward the end of the talk, but it's not a whole talk on AI. But the thing is, AI can help you with your documentation because you can tell it the format you want it in, and then you can talk through the decision and then leave the models that have summarization and classification abilities to take what you told it and put it to its ADR, to that format. When I say you can talk to the ADI or talk to the AI about your decision, many of these tools now have voice support. So you can literally just push the button and talk through it. Sometimes it's a lot easier than typing. Okay, so we talked about what, which, when, who. Well, where do we capture these? How many of you have decision records today? Okay, I see some hands up. Anybody want to share where they're keeping their decision records?
Project Wiki.
Project Wiki?
I'm actually keeping them in my Git repo.
In the Git repo? Okay. So we got Project Wiki, we got Git repo. Any others?
SAP's LeanIX.
SAP, what was that?
LeanIX. They acquired LeanIX.
Okay, LeanIX?
Yeah.
Okay. So where would you store these? Those are great spots, depending on the context. You could store them in a document store, so formal document store platforms. You could store them in a formal document control system. And I'm going to step away from the bullet points a minute to tell a story on this. So I used to work in manufacturing in their IT department, and that's where I got exposed to a formal document control system. These are documents that have numbers associated with them. Sometimes they're version numbers that make sense to us as developers. Sometimes they're looking at these document numbers like, where did they come from with that number? It gets weird, like funkier than GUIDs. But there's a process. And so I learned from them how you would create the form, And I had to know this process because inevitably the business folks would come up to me and go, we need to create a form and we don't know how to do this. And so I'd show them, but inevitably they'd be like, you're quicker at this, can you just create the form? I'm like, fine. That was part of IT's role. So I had to know that it went through a draft process. Everybody looked at it. Then we had a proposed process so that document control could look at it and go, okay, do we have another version of this form? Nope, okay. They would do their approvals and things. And then finally it would go into a active status. And then finally, eventually it would get retired and replaced with a newer version. But it's a formal process, and a lengthy process. We could store decision records on an intranet or in a folder. Again, working in manufacturing, they had their intranet. It was a classic ASP site, so that tells you how old it was. But everybody went to the intranet for information. You wanted to know where your benefits were. You want to know the employee handbook and where that's at. You want to know documentation for understanding how to work with a particular client. It was all in one spot on the intranet. And so we could put decision records there. There's the in a wiki. When it comes to storing decisions, you want it in a place where all who are impacted can review the decision records. So up there we had somebody mention that they store them in their Git repo. If you're working in code and everybody has access to that Git repo and they feel comfortable in that platform, then it makes sense to store the documentation with the code. However, you have to consider your business use. And so you have to understand the platforms that your business uses. Sometimes you have to use Confluence, Jira, and those. Put your decision records in like a Confluence kind of setup. I run into developers who are like, no, I just want to live in my code. And I'm like, but no, you're not the only person who uses these. So keep that in mind, that whenever you're storing your decision records, you want to make sure that they're accessible to those who really need access to them. Okay, so how are decisions captured? All right, we're going to take a look at the timeline of the decisions at a high level, but this is something that could also be more formalized. So we identify that, hey, a decision needs to get made. Then we gather all the relevant info for what we have to decide on. We justify the decision. We document that decision. We communicate the decision, which is usually telling somebody, by the way, I documented it, and you can find the document here. Always works well in a Slack, if you're in a particular Slack channel or Discord channel or Teams channel or whatever your other platforms may be. Just a, hey, by the way, we put this decision record out. And then there's the execute on the decision. Like I said, I've given this talk a few times, and somebody suggested an implemented status. That's awesome, because then you can see that, okay, it's been executed on. Now, when it comes to architecture decision committees, these are large enterprises, or it's medium businesses that are trying to grow, and it can get a little chaotic. The architecture decision committees are folks who will review to make sure that does the ADR fit in the format that is required by the company? Does it have all the information that makes sense? Was this the right decision to make? And if there are any other things that need to be considered, they might push back on that. So it can get to be pretty lengthy in terms of time. Sometimes your decision documentation might be held up. But at least document it, because then that way you've got the context out of your head, and at least on a piece of paper or a markdown document or whatever document you use. All right, let's look at some examples of decisions to capture. This is going to go back to those different categories. The first one I deal with this often is security with multi-factor authentication options. So this is what the ADR looks like. I'm going to zoom in, so don't panic like, oh, that's really small. Yes, I know. So let's start here. Looks good. Can you all see it? Okay, I see some thumbs up. Up top, you all okay up there too? Cool. All right, so we have, let me show. We got that ADR 003. I don't think it's going to let me do the zoom and the laser pointer, so we'll just talk through it. Up at the top, that ADR 003, that's the identifier part of the title that I mentioned. Security decision, multi-factor authentication. You don't have to say security decision. You could just say multi-factor authentication and leave it at that. Then we have a date. Now, I don't mention date in the formats necessarily, but I want to show you that this is something to think about because this captures the when. Yes, sequentially, if you're using numbers like that, you could see like a timeline that way, but having a date gives you a more concrete timeline. Like how long ago was this decision really made? How long ago is that context really lost? Then you got the status. This is active. So this is using NIGARD's format as a base and some alternatives. So we've got the context. Why do we have to have a decision on security and MFA, or multi-factor authentication? The reason is because with multi-factor authentication, certain factors are more compromisable than others. And so I use this often with others. So our decision is that we're going to implement multi-factor authentication requiring at least 2 factors, so minimum 2FA. We have a section in here for options considered. That way we know what did we look at, what did we consider, and why didn't we go with that? So we considered 2-factor authentication with email and SMS. That's an option. Then we thought about 2-factor authentication with email and SMS with time-based one-time passwords. So how many of you with your accounts use authenticator apps? Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. You know password managers like LastPass and Team Password Manager also have support nowadays for these time-based one-time passwords. So it's no longer just tied to your mobiles. Fantastic. And option 3 was full multi-factor authentication with biometrics, authenticator apps, and passkeys. So now you can see, well, this is what we're looking at. And then we have our rationale. So justify, why would we go through these? What were we considering? And then there's the consequences. When I do consequences, I do call out positive because that's what they had suggested in the software architecture. The fundamentals of software architecture. I call out positive though because most of us think consequences as in like there's punishment for doing bad again. There are consequences. But there's actually positive consequences as well. And then there's open issues. So things we need to consider based on our decision. So you can see, do we go with email and SMS? Well, we can do email and SMS, but they're vulnerable to phishing attacks and SIM swapping and other interception methods. That's a security concern. Stronger authentication? Yes. Let's take a look at the factors that are a little bit easier. So biometrics, time-based one-time passwords, and then authenticator apps, they have time-based there. But then passkeys, you're starting to see more adoption for that as well. So the trade-offs are going to be, what can you afford to implement in terms of time, in terms of security, in terms of adoption, and take it from there. So that's the format we used. And the reason why we documented that is because it is an architectural capability, hence architectural characteristics. So security is one of those that I put up front because we really need to think about that. Modular monolith versus clean architecture is another common one I deal with. So you see the logo. I work for Nimble Pros. And if you know my boss, you know Steve talks about clean architecture and modular monoliths. And I do too now. But how do you know which one you want to use for your projects? And so this ADR example, you can see that we're trying to figure out clean architecture versus modular monolith. I will zoom in again. This one's accepted. Now, the decision that we made on this one, so we put the decision at the top in these things. Think of it as the too long didn't read. Like, I just want the decision. Give me the answer now. I don't care about the why. But maybe you do care about the why, but just spoilers, just what was decided. So we chose to implement clean architecture. And so there's consequences, like the trade-offs, things like that. And then there's additional notes. And so you can see that we went with clean architecture, but we don't have a lot of domain knowledge because we didn't at the time. None of us work in that particular industry. We didn't have the right words. We could watch TV shows in the industry to help us learn words. But again, we didn't have that domain. So that's why we went with clean architecture rather than a modular monolith. Because with modular monoliths, if you understand your domain, you know how to splice things up because you've got a good feel for it, that might have made more sense. But for that particular project, at the time, we didn't know. We know that there's a lot of stuff we didn't know, and there's probably even more stuff in the we didn't know that we didn't know. So it's even further out. This is structure. So I remember when we started this project, it was just almost a year ago. And we were just like, where do we go? And I'm like, I've got the decision. And they just looked at me funny, and I'm like, we don't know this stuff yet. So clean architecture is easier. The other thing is .NET version. Now you're probably going, .NET version? Why does that matter? Well, the thing is, so we'll zoom in. We started out with .NET 9 on this particular example. And the reason we did that is, notice the date. That's July 3rd. .NET 9 was the version at the time. .NET 10, we knew it was coming in November because of Microsoft. Microsoft has had release in November for .NET. .NET Conf is coming, here's the new version. We know that it's there. So did we dare work with the preview bits? The privilege of this project is it was greenfield. There's no existing code. We're starting from scratch. So do we go with preview bits and hope that when they release .NET 10, it's going to be easy? Or do we go with what we know? Now, you can see here, so we had a context. We added a problem statement. So what is the problem that we had? And so we were trying to figure out things like, okay, we know this particular version is an STS, which is, I think, standard support, versus the LTS, which is a long-term support. The new version is going to be the LTS. So those trade-offs of lifecycle support, what's getting obsoleted, things like that. Those are the problems. How do we solve it? Well, .NET 8 was the long-term support. .NET 9 short-term, or the standard support. And then .NET 10, do we want to start with it initially? If we went with .NET 9, so now we have the rationale. Let's look at the thinking through the decision, and then how we went from there. And then we had an insight that we could just start at .NET 9 and upgrade to .NET 10 as soon as possible. And then we talked about positives and negatives. But ultimately, we did decide to go with .NET 9. So this helped us to capture, okay, this is the platform we choose, the specific version, and then all the things considered. Because we were talking about a current long term that was going to be phased out, the standard term was, again, standard, so shorter support. And then the next long term support was in a few months. That's how we ended up with the .NET 9 to .NET 10. The reason, though, why we documented it is because this is structure. This is also construction. All right. The last one I want to show is domain events in C#. But notice that the subtitle there is Demo of Using AI to Generate the Record. Now, I'm going to show you no Wi-Fi. This is something I recorded on this particular laptop because I do run AI locally. And so what I did, I'm going to zoom in so you can see the prompt. So I was using Gemma 3 at the time, which is a model from Google. And I told it I needed to generate ADR for C# and using domain events. When I'm talking with AI and giving it a prompt, I'm very specific. Now, nowadays, with agentic AI, I could probably have a skills file to do this, but this is what I had to work with at the time. So I would tell it, generate the decision as a markdown code fence. Because this particular project, we store it in our Git. It's markdown. We tell it to specify the title as ADR with an H1. If I don't specify H1 and H2, leaving it to the AI was not giving me the format I wanted. So I had to refine the prompts as I was going. Like, I want it laid out this way. I want these headlines to be formatted as this. And then there was things for the status, the consequences, the additional notes, things like that. So we got a video. And you can see that AI is generating that. So you can see the markdown. So I specified markdown code fence to be very specific. I could probably tell it to make the file, and then just download the file. So it did the formats. Now, the actual, what I said, if it's going to let me rewind that video. I don't think it's going to let it. So I ended up using in this, so I use Open Web UI. And I use a newer version than what's on the slides. But there's this microphone button. And so I just press the microphone button and I talk through, these are the different things we want to do. This is the decision we made. These are the different context pieces because I was tired of typing. And so I just did the microphone thing and told it. And it did a pretty good job of generating the ADR. So when it comes to using AI for generating decision records, you have to be explicit in what you're looking for. You tell it to specify the headings in a particular order. And when I tell you to specify the headings, it's going to be things like, what is the status? Do you want a date field? Do you want the context? Do you want to follow NIGARDs? Do you want to follow the fundamentals of software architecture? Does your company have its own format? So the headings are, what are those descriptions for those sections? Then there's the specify the format. As you saw in my demo, I asked for a markdown code fence because I knew it was going to be pasted into markdown. At that time, I was not on the agentic AI train, and so that's why it would be a copy and paste. If you trust your agents, like I said, a skills file would probably help with that. Talk it through your decision or type it through your decisions, but tell the story. Get the context out. When it comes to working with AI, You want to make sure you have a model that supports summarization and classification. So we're talking about models like Claude Sonnet, Claude Opus, Gemini, OpenAI's GPT 5.4 and higher, QN3, especially if you're in technical environments, if you're doing technical documentation, that's where QN3 would shine. But you want to use models that have these capabilities because then it can do the reasoning and applying, okay, you said this, we'll summarize this, reason it as to this goes to this classification based on its own reasoning. Now that said, once it's done, you need to review the documentation. So you let it organize it, but then make sure that it's actually what you want it to be. So this is the ADR that it created for me. And you can see we're talking about domain events. And so we're talking about how do we implement them. And at the time we were using fast endpoints. And this one is in draft. So this isn't adopted, this isn't active just yet. We talk about things like reducing complexity and other things. Additional notes, so you can see we talked about go with mediator and service bus, which at the time didn't make sense for what we needed. That said, that has changed about a year, so I got to update this document. All right, so we talked about the who, we talked about the which, we talked about the where, the when, talked pretty much about the why, and the how. So in summary, you're going to document the decision because someone is going to ask why. And that someone may be you. Now, if you want to learn more about ADRs, I will share a PDF of this slide deck in Discord. So there's that. We do have questions in Discord. So if you go to the Discord link in the bottom right corner, you can ask questions there. I am monitoring that. I will be around for the next a couple hours or so, and then look at it later tonight as well. But I will put a PDF there. I'll post these additional resources. So if you're a command line person, ADR-tools is a command line tool to generate ADRs. It is fantastic. Fundamentals of software architecture. So that was the first format I showed you. Then there's documenting architecture decisions from Nygaard. Joel Parker Henderson's GitHub repo on ADRs. I cannot rave about this one enough. So many links, so many different formats, so much guidance. The architecture decision record. So for you Microsoft folks, the Microsoft Azure well-architected framework has great guidance behind ADRs. If you're more of an AWS person, I got you there too. So AWS prescriptive guidance on ADRs as well. We know they do things differently but the same. Any questions? All right. Anybody happen to be in the Discord? Any questions?
Check real quick.
Okay. Well, our proctor's going to check real quick to see if there's any questions in Discord. No questions. Well, if you have any questions, please post in Discord, or you can contact me. I'm a senior trainer at Nimble Pros, so first name, last name. I will post that in the Discord as well, so you can copy paste that. My LinkedIn is already posted. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you all for coming today, and enjoy your Stir Trek.